Why did Father John Melnick choose the old Roman Catholic See of Caer-Glow or the Oblates of St. Augustine? First off, I would like to say that this video isn't intended to detract from any of the groups mentioned in the thumbnail or mentioned throughout the course of this video. Obviously, when you're talking about making a selection for something, you have to not choose other things. That's just the nature of making choices. Just because you decide to marry somebody doesn't mean every other human being that exists is not worthy of marriage or something like that. No, you choose one because it fits, it works for you. So I don't mean in any way to detract from anybody else or anybody else's choices, or in a sense any of the groups to make them to disparage them or anything like that. That's first and foremost. Father John and I belong to the Society of St. Augustine, a public association of the faithful in the Archdiocese of Kansas City in Kansas. Father John was my de facto formator because the person who was in charge of me, the novice master, never really met with me throughout the course of my novitiate. I think we met twice. And so Father John, I mentioned this to Father John, and Father John became my de facto formator to provide me formation, which was great because that's what he was trained to do in the Order of St. Augustine. And of course, I learned so much from him during my time as a novice. But also, when I took first vows, you had to take first vows 3 times in order to get to final vows. But during the course of this time, who should have been my novice master was anti-tradition. He discovered that I loved tradition, that Father John and I were Eidolon great. I was in a sense his protege, but he did not want the Society of St. Augustine to become a traditional Latin Mass community. And so he brought this to the attention of the Chancery, thinking that he would somehow be appointed superior of the community and or get me ousted. And Archbishop Naumann eventually concluded that the Society of St. Augustine, they were not allowed to receive any more members into vows, meaning that the 3 priests that were there, they could remain there, wear their habits, and die out, but they could not accept any new members, which affected me because I was not yet in final vows. So when my temporary vows ran out, I had to leave. And so Father John approached me because he knew I had a vocation. And this is something that every single one of my spiritual directors has all confirmed throughout my life, that I have a vocation. And he wanted to see me realize this vocation. So he wanted to help me find a place. Having worked for Ecclesia Dei, having worked for the Fraternity of St. Peter, Father John was well networked, and his reputation was such that, his recommendation would serve me very well. But during this time that I was with the Society of St. Augustine, Father John would visit Archbishop Humphreys down in Florida at least twice a year, once in the summer and then during winter break. And I got to see for myself who the old Roman Catholics really are. The way Father John described it was, it's like walking into a church as if Vatican II never happened. So in a sense, it wasn't some sort of reactionary thing against Vatican II-isms and all that kind of stuff. It was just people that kept on keeping on. And so I saw that occasionally, as I came down to Florida to visit, just to be a guest, just to get away from the ordinary, so to speak, throughout the school year, summer and winter vacation. And so I got to know these people for myself. I got to see things for myself. So Father John sat me down and he started going through the options with me. Okay, you could go to the Fraternity of St. Peter and go to the SSPX. You can try some of these other, Papa Stranze, Redemptorist groups, Clear Creek Abbey, these sorts of groups. And I told him how I felt about each of them. One, I don't feel called to the contemplative life, strictly. So Clear Creek, the Redemptorists, Transalpine Redemptorists, I probably wouldn't do well there. I mean, that's not my vocation. And of course, you have to have a vocation to these things, these groups, these charisms, in order to fit in, to work well, and to grow in holiness in each of these communities. And so I felt I didn't have a vocation to the exclusively, intense contemplative life. I felt something more mendicant, more apostolic, while at the same time having a contemplative nature to the charism as well. And so for me, it was more along the lines of like Franciscan, Dominican, Augustinian, these sorts of communities. And also for that reason, I felt a desire, a vocation to take the evangelical counsels as vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. For that reason, being just a parish priest didn't make sense to me either, in terms of Fraternity of St. Peter or the Society of St. Pius X. But then in discussing these 2 communities, Father John had unique insight, simply because he had been a part of the Fraternity of St. Peter, and also with Ecclesia Dei, he knew a lot about the SSPX as well, and not just from his own dealings in Ecclesia Dei, but also the founding members of the Fraternity of St. Peter came from the SSPX. And so he had a lot of friendships from those in the FSSP who were ordained by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. But ultimately, these places didn't really fit me either, in the sense that there was a huge problem with Vatican II. And in many cases in these 2 communities, you can't point those mistakes out. You can't point those errors out. You can't speak publicly against certain errors or certain things. And oftentimes your voice is controlled. So given the nature of the situation, especially when this was under the pontificate of Pope Francis, it was necessary to consider all of these things. So for me in the Society of St. Augustine, time ran out. Father John left the community as well, and we moved down to Florida to the Old Roman Catholic Seminary, not to join the Old Romans at that point, not to join them, but simply because Archbishop Humphreys allowed us a place to stay so that we could decide eventually where to go. Incredible generosity on his part and on the part of the Old Roman Catholic See of Caer-Glow. So it was while here that we began contacting bishops. We had contacted a bishop in Idaho. We had a priest friend speak to Bishop Strickland, though Father John and I were never hopeful about this, not because we didn't believe Bishop Strickland would be open to the idea. We actually did believe that Bishop Strickland would eventually be removed. And we have to think long terms about the situation in terms of founding a community, because you have to be concerned about the successor of the person who accepts you in, because you could be there for a year or 2 years and then be told to leave, get out, suppressed. So we had to consider that as well. And given how fiery Bishop Strickland was about the faith, good thing, we knew he would be a target of Bergoglio, and the history proves us that we were actually correct. So that was one of the reasons why Tyler, Texas was never an option. I had a friend who recommended the Diocese of Charlotte, North Carolina, but we believed that the same thing would happen there, and only recently did the exact same thing happen, in the sense of Bishop Martin shutting down the traditional Latin masses in his diocese. So we knew these things would take place. Father John and I actually visited Bishop Cressida out in Corpus Christi, and he gave us a lot of encouragement, gave me a lot of encouragement. I had a private one-on-one conversation with him. He said he would love to ordain me, of course, but he couldn't because I didn't have demissorial letters. But he also, confirmed for me again that I had a vocation, that I should persevere. Bishop Cressida actually did me a great favor, many great favors, but one of them being particularly calling the bishop of the Diocese of St. Petersburg and asking if he would accept our community. The bishop of St. Petersburg told Bishop Cressida that he has enough priests, but he would recommend me to the Diocese of Venice, which is just south of St. Petersburg, to see if they would be interested in taking our community in. A priest in the chancery of the Diocese of Venice called Father John to speak to us about Hispanic ministry. I guess maybe he saw my last name, Navarro, and thought maybe we do Hispanic ministry. Father John said, yeah, Brother Martin would love to do Hispanic ministry, even Novus Ordo, all that kind of stuff. But the community itself, in-house, traditional Latin Mass, traditional breviary, exclusively. We thought that was, great compromise, right? Help out the diocese, meanwhile they leave us alone to have the masses of all times and the true traditional divine office. But the answer that Father John got back was, I'll take it to my bishop, don't call us, we'll call you. And of course, never heard back. Eventually, we found a place to stay in the Diocese of Kansas City, St. Joseph. Of course, we know the Benedictine sisters who perform the great music there, who are Tridentine Rite. There was also another group of canon regulars at the time that was up there. People would think that would be a safe place to be. However, unfortunately, we came under attack by a now non-existent Catholic TMZ outlet that completely destroyed our reputation for their own personal gain, and so that didn't help us either. I have a video on Restless Heart Media describing the events. So it's not just bishops that are trying to destroy the traditional Latin Mass and prevent traditional communities trying to exist. It's also lay people, news organizations that feel that they have the power because they have a reach, they have a voice. Of course, during this process, between the years 2020 and 2025, in 2021, Traditiones Custodes came out saying that anybody who's newly ordained cannot offer the traditional Latin Mass. I was not yet ordained, therefore looking for a diocese was kind of pointless, in the sense that I wouldn't have ever been able to have faculties to say the traditional Latin Mass. So in 2022, Father John's idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis takes a turn for the worst, and he passes away in mid-January of 2023. At that point, I need to make a decision. Father John himself, from our own private conversations, had always told me that he trusts Archbishop Humphreys, and he trusts Bishop Meikle, and he trusts the See of Caer-Glow to, as a father saying to a son, take care of you when I'm gone. Bishop Meikle had been a student of Father John when Father John was teaching in the seminary in Toronto, and Bishop Meikle went all the way through the seminary under kind of a spiritual direction of Father John's, and that they were good friends. Like Bishop Meikle would go to the modernist classes during the day, and then go to Father John's living room where there'd be other underground traditional priests to give other seminarians continued formation, so to speak, in tradition. And so, having been one of his students, Father John trusted Bishop Meikle. And so it is a spiritual father saying to his son, if I have to choose a place for you, this would be it, because this is the place where you can be a traditional Catholic priest without worrying whether or not you'll be thrown out on the streets. Because one problem with a lot of institutions is many people in those institutions prioritize institution over people, policy over people. And that was one thing Father John was always concerned about because of what had happened to him in every place he had ever gone. So Father John, having known this community, this group, See of Caer-Glow, for over 20 years, visiting twice a year, friends with all of their clergy, can confirm that this group is in fact Catholic. They believe all 20 doctrinal councils, all the dogmas of the Catholic faith, and live its moral praxis. Obviously, they're so unknown to the internet because they kind of made an effort to stay off the internet. They're so unknown to the internet, in the age of the internet, everybody constantly looks at the word old and thinks they deny Vatican I or papal infallibility or things like that. But it really just takes getting to know them to realize that this place can be a home to traditional Catholics. And it is the home of traditional Catholics. And that's all these people are. That's all they're trying to be. No one's trying to create a kingdom in and of around themselves to be the only group in traditional Catholicism to be preserving the faith. We work with everybody. We are not the church. We are just merely a part of it. We are not the traditional movement. We are merely a part of it. We're a part of a group. We're a part of a whole. And we don't claim to be the kings or the kingmakers. So I hope this video sheds a little bit more light into the thinking process, the discernment process that Father John and I went to in trying to find a place where we could establish this community, the Oblates of St. Augustine, and where I would be able to be ordained and be a true traditionalist Catholic priest. It's not as black and white, no pun intended, these days as it might seem to be. A lot of people give legal matters, canonical matters, heavier weight, but when the ultimate judges of canon law are the bishops, is the Pope, who obviously have an ideological agenda for the church, for their dioceses, it's definitely worth considering whether the faith serves the institution or the institution the faith. And it's pretty clear that without the faith, the institution means nothing. Viva Cristo Rey.